Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're setting the stage for a completely data-driven, impartial look at the massive, long-term economic dynamic between the United States and China. For years, the headlines have just been screaming about this direct clash, America versus China, with massive policies and sweeping tariffs totally dominating the news cycle. But, if we actually look closely at the data and the underlying strategies, a very different picture starts to emerge. We're going to map out how this grand geopolitical chess match is really being played beyond the daily noise and what it ultimately means for the global economy. Let's kick things off with a wild scenario. Picture this. It's May 2026, and Donald Trump flies to Beijing on Air Force One to negotiate. But he isn't alone. Sitting right alongside him are executives who control tens of trillions of dollars: Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Jensen Huang. Now really think about that for a second. Beijing didn't fly to Washington. Washington flew to Beijing. This one scenario completely flips the script on the story we've been told about who actually holds the leverage in this relationship. It shows a slow rebalancing of the world order, happening not with tanks, but with billionaires on private jets. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. Playing the long game. 2. Monopolizing the future. 3. Rewiring global finance. 4. Cracks in the foundation. And finally, 5. What this means for you. Starting off with Section 1, Playing the long game. U.S. tariffs versus China. To really grasp this dynamic, I want you to imagine a boxing match where one fighter is throwing these massive haymakers, while the other just calmly steps out of the way. The U.S. throws heavy punches using sweeping tariffs, but instead of taking the hit, China acts kind of like water flowing around a fork. How? Through tariff rerouting. See, when the U.S. slaps a massive tariff on Chinese goods, sure, direct Chinese exports to America technically go down, but their overall exports are hitting record highs. A product that used to go straight from a factory in Guangzhou to Ohio now takes a quick detour to Vietnam. It gets repackaged, they slap a new label on it, and boom, shipped to Ohio. The Chinese factory isn't paying that tariff. The cost is ultimately passed right onto the American consumer. It's the same product, same profits, just in a different box. Moving right along to Section 2, Monopolizing the Future. China's water wells. Imagine you run the only water well in a town of 50,000 people. Your leverage? It's basically infinite. Well, China hasn't just been building factories. They've systematically positioned themselves to own the water wells for the exact industries the modern global economy literally cannot live without. Let's rapid fire through these monopolies because the numbers are staggering. Rare earths? China refines about 90% of them. Batteries? They produce 80% of the world's lithium-ion supply. Solar panels? Over 80%. Electric vehicles? Their domestic manufacturer BYD actually outsold Tesla. And all of this is the direct result of a 2015 government blueprint called Made in China 2025. A lot of Western analysts brushed it off as just propaganda back then, but Beijing successfully hit roughly 86% of its goals. And the visual contrast in something like global commercial shipbuilding is just wild. China is currently building more than 53% of the world's commercial ships. The United States, about 0.1%. To put some real-world perspective on that, recently China delivered 972 commercial ships in a single year. The U.S. delivered 7. Just 7. Which brings us to Section 3, Rewiring Global Finance. Bypassing the dollar. Having physical goods is one thing, but the absolute ultimate power in our modern world is financial, right? And framing this whole situation as simply America versus China completely misses reality. The rest of the world isn't really picking sides here. They are actively hedging their bets. Europe is quietly putting together a plan B. The Middle East is joining BRICS and seriously discussing pricing oil in yuan. Africa is heavily locked into China's Belt and Road infrastructure. Latin America now sees China as its largest trading partner. And this is absolutely crucial. Through the digital Silk Road, countries are installing Chinese 5G networks and payment systems. Once those digital foundations are poured, the switching costs become massive. This perfectly sets up what we like to call the two sockets metaphor. Right now, America owns the dominant socket, the US dollar. It allows the US to weaponize sanctions and cut countries completely out of the SWIFT banking system without ever firing a bullet. China knows this, so they aren't trying to magically replace the dollar tomorrow. Instead, they are systematically installing a backup socket all around the world. They're using their own payment systems like SIPs, digital currency projects like Enbridge, and hoarding massive gold reserves. If the US ever tries to cut a country's power, that country can just plug right into China's backup socket and keep the lights on. And honestly, a lot of this difference in strategy boils down to how these two superpowers measure time. The U.S. strategy naturally zigzags every 4 years with the election cycle. A new administration might come in and completely rip up the previous one's agenda. But Chinese leadership, they measure time in decades. They have a clear timeline running all the way to 2049, the centenary of the People's Republic. That's exactly why China loves utilizing these slow, gray zone tactics rather than risking some massive immediate war that could unravel decades of planning overnight. They figure they just have to outlast their opponent's patience. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is Section 4, Cracks in the Foundation, China's Weaknesses.
If we stopped the explainer right here, you'd probably think China is just this totally unstoppable juggernaut. But the truth? Right now, China is actually in a race against its own internal collapse. There are 7 massive structural cracks threatening them from the inside out. You've got an imploding property market marked by the epic collapse of giants like Evergrande. Local governments are sitting on an estimated $18 to $20 trillion in debt. Trillion. Plus, they're facing a terrifying deflation doom loop, where really anxious consumers are just refusing to spend, which causes businesses to freeze hiring. And that leads to unofficial youth unemployment hitting an insane 21%. Add in all their excess industrial capacity that's actively angering their global trade partners, and wealthy citizens who are quietly sneaking their capital out of the country. 250 million. Just let that sink in for a moment. That is the staggering projected drop in China's population by the year 2050. That is almost the entire population of the United States literally just vanishing. The very factories and workforce that powered their massive economic rise are going to be running out of workers, right as their pension system gets squeezed to death by an aging population. It's a ticking demographic time bomb. So let's bring it all home with Section 5, what this means for you the next 10 years. We've got the unstoppable force of China's long-term strategy slamming into the immovable object of its own structural decay. But what does this massive geopolitical chess match actually mean for your savings, your career, and your everyday life? Well, here are 5 actionable takeaways. First up, prepare for structural inflation. Tariffs and supply chain shifts naturally push prices up over the long haul. Second, hold hard assets. Historically, things like real estate or productive businesses preserve your wealth way better than cash. Third, you've got to adapt to the K-shape economy. The gap between people who own assets and people who purely earn wages is going to widen drastically. Fourth, brace yourself for major labor shifts as AI and new tariffs start hollowing out generic white-collar work. And fifth, beware of media gaslighting from all sides trying to push really extreme narratives. Because here's the deal. Both American and Chinese media are going to try to sell you a super simplified story of either total victory or total collapse. But the reality, sitting right there in the data, shows us that the era of cheap, stable, and predictable globalization, it's over. The board has fundamentally changed. Are you going to be distracted by the daily noise, or are you preparing for the end of cheap, predictable globalization so you can actually thrive in this new global reality? Thank you so much for joining the Explainer today.